we're kind of seeing in real time in Ethereum land, especially, how a lot of what started off as like kind of like an ethos, how a lot of this alignment has started to become more about business and about commercialization. Where typically the thing that is being put up as being aligned with Ethereum is being put up by people that benefit from that perception, such as L2s benefit from being perceived as being Ethereum aligned. And so when you look at like people that don't have L2s or that aren't really in any way connected to L2s or have any sort of business dependencies or revenue dependencies or future plans to be on an L2, when those people say that L2s are Ethereum, I listen.
Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Fuel Labs, who's launching Fuel Ignition, a new high-performance Ethereum L2 powered by the FuelVM. Now you're going to be hearing all about Ignition later in the program, but for now, what you need to know is they are launching phase 2 of their points program. So click the link at the bottom of the show notes and head over, start experimenting, messing around on Fuel today. Thank me later. Hey everyone, quick disclaimer before we get into today's episode. Nothing said on Bell Curve is a recommendation to buy or sell securities or tokens. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely our opinions, not financial advice. Our guests and I may hold positions in the companies, funds, or projects discussed. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Today, I'm joined by Alex Watts. Alex, welcome to the program, man.
Mike, thanks for having me, dude.
Yeah, man, I'm pumped to do this. I got to give you a little bit of due here because we've talked about a lot of technical subjects over the years. I did a whole MEV season with Hasu, and I should have credited you with exec producer for that season because whenever I had a question about how does this crazy MEV stuff work, you were one of my first calls and deserve more credit in the overall history of Bell Curve than I feel like you've gotten. So it's good that we can make this episode work.
Oh, dude, I'm super excited to be here, and I really like that season a lot too. I was, dude, I really appreciated that. You reached out to me. From my point of view, dude, Hasu is a legend. He's like one of the OGs, and yeah, since then, I've actually just started pinging him directly rather than like, "Hey, Mike, can you ask this? Hey, Mike, but dude, I love that season. That's like one of the all-time best podcast seasons in all of crypto in my mind.
Oh, thanks, man. You know, the other thing about Hasu is that he's a very nice guy. It was a fun. Obviously a very intellectual powerhouse of a dude, but yeah, very nice guy, very fun to do it with, and yeah, man, I don't want to sell you short as well either. Like a lot of the, I think that MEV and just a lot of the technical discussion in crypto falls prey to the same groupthink. And you are someone who I consistently will talk to, and oh, I wasn't really thinking about it like that, or that's a different way of approaching that issue. And I'm excited to get into some of that with you today. And some of what we're going to be talking about actually is, I guess, the headline, if we had to put one to this episode, would be the differences in the EVM versus the SVM. And part of the reason I'm interested in having this discussion with you is because obviously everyone is bullish on the yellow coin and the SVM because it's parallelization and everything goes fast. And I'm, for what it's worth, highly influenced by those arguments. But you rarely hear people make the opposite argument about things that the EVM can do better than the SVM. And so I'm interested to get the devil's advocate take on that. And then we'll end with a little bit of a spicy take on some of the standard stuff that's going on in Ethereum today. But before we get there, Alex, could you just give everyone a little bit of a background on yourself and FastLane? And in particular, I'm interested in the early days of FastLane, the smart contracting solution that you built over at Polygon. And then we can kind of do a neat through line into the work that you're doing today.
Absolutely. So I first got started in MEV back in 2020, just doing very basic stablecoin arbitrage on an exchange called Titan. And I had a blast doing it. I made way more money than I thought I was going to make doing it. And that is what prompted me to go from TradFi, but not HFT TradFi, more like, sales and Excel spreadsheet TradFi, into crypto full time. And was doing MEV on Polygon in particular, doing a lot of market making, so-called, or CeFi DeFi arbitrage, as well as atomic arbitrage, as well as stablecoin minting, redeeming arbitrage, even liquidations. And it was a lot of fun. Had a blast doing it. And then Polygon started to get put under too much stress by spam transactions. And at that time, I was playing for, the red team, so to speak. And I was also just spamming a pretty decent amount. Not as much as some people, but I was no stranger to spam. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, if someone doesn't do something about people like me, then that could lead to very bad problems for the Polygon blockchain. And so I actually reached out to one of the teams that had started running a MEVGeth fork on Polygon. And I actually pitched them this solution that later became FastLane. And at the time, they had said, no, this is suboptimal game theory. This is suboptimal mechanism design. Validators aren't going to want to run this. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, validators don't want to run MEVGeth on Polygon. And the reason why they didn't want to run MEVGeth isn't because MEVGeth is a bad program. It's an objectively more profitable program than what I was proposing. Like, I wasn't trying to say that I had some more profitable type of MEV architecture than what
Mm.
Flashbots did. Flashbots had a better program for sure. But on Polygon, the validators were not willing to run custom clients. And the reason why they weren't willing to run custom clients is because the Polygon Foundation had told them not to in a very loud message. And this was when Polygon was under a period of high stress. Validators, especially institutional like validators, your entities like Coinbase, Binance, Figment, etc. These validation companies are very risk averse. They're also very beholden to the interests of their stakers. And this is, in a way, very different from the proof of work miners, or, like, the mining coalitions that had existed before.
Mm.
The miners were typically very technically savvy, very, DevOps focused entities and organizations. Whereas with proof of stake, these validators are, in essence, asset managers, right? Their job is to go out, talk to institutional investors, talk to large stakeholders in the ecosystems, largely talk to the foundation of that specific ecosystem, and to then use that stake and produce more blocks and to earn a yield for them. But it's a very different risk profile. And
Mm.
so when people at Polygon were telling these validators don't run custom clients, these aren't your cypherpunk miners who are like, well, we're going to do it anyway. You can't stop us. These are institutional validators. They're like, okay, we won't. And so but it's like here's this other team on Polygon, like, running this ecosystem, being like, all right, well, we're going to be able to talk them into running MEVGeth on Polygon because it makes more money. And it's like, well, Polygon Foundation is saying not to, and validators are going to not do that. And so what I had proposed is a system that would allow validators to earn MEV without modifying the validator client. And the way that this worked was by effectively throttling transactions on the way in
Mm.
and gating them in such a way that, without the validator having to actually do anything at all, these transactions would just so happen to arrive in the exact right order to make a very profitable block. And
Mm.
again, like, not as profitable as MEVGeth, for sure, to be clear, but still quite profitable and still a big improvement over nothing. And the neat
Mm.
thing is, in order to do this, the validators didn't have to do anything. They still ran the regular vanilla client, no modification. They just had to peer with us, and we would take care of the rest by sending them things in the right order. And yeah, it was a blast. I actually pitched this idea to the team that was running the MEV system for Polygon at the time. They were very stubborn. They made a lot of comments about how this is not game theoretically optimal, and this is not something that validators are
Man,
interested in.
those are fighting words in crypto, not
I know.
not not game theory optimal. Oh, my heart, my soul.
Like, I'm just so the game theologists, there's a lot of really smart game theory, and they weren't wrong. It's not game theoretically optimal, but it doesn't fucking matter if no one fucking runs the program. you know like, game theory stops
So
where
real.
compliance departments start,
Mm.
and a lot of these validators had, like, pretty big compliance departments. Um,
You know what? Just to comment on that as well is that I think that we in crypto sometimes are guilty of assuming that we're designing all of these systems in a vacuum and that everything needs to be completely incentive compatible, game theory compatible. And honestly, I mean, it's kind of an interesting, I don't want to go off too far on a tangent here, but it's like, why aren't there more 51% attacks on with networks that have really low economic security? Because I think they're illegal, and because like all these other reasons. And so it's a little funny to me that I don't know. There are like no assumptions about anything extra jurisdictional in these chains and designs. But
Dude, no,
yeah.
like, dude, you're 100% right. And I think one of the other just fascinating things is that when you look at the game theory like decisions and designs, like a lot of them make a lot of sense up until you realize that the same participants that are supposed to be limited by these new designs are also the ones that are voting on whether or not they're implemented. And so it's like, yeah, we can talk about how like EPBS allows like for more MEV burn, for less MEV for validators to make validators more incentive compatible. But and like and again, that game theory is all true. But validators are the ones voting on whether or not we even do EPBS. So it's like I don't know. There's a lot of just little quirks where yeah, like I like the game theory. I think it's fascinating. I love the models. I love the research. I read all of it. Like it's all real. It's all right. It's all good. I just don't know that it's all applicable all the
I
time.
mean, dude, I feel that so hard. I mean, this whole podcast is basically for people that get nerd sniped about this stuff. That is why bell curve exists, right? That is the mo. But I have had that feeling before as well, where you know, I'm sort of what this is a little bit emblematic actually of sometimes how I felt in between what Ethereum chooses to focus on versus Solana focuses on. And look, I love the games theory stuff and the mech design and the auctions and all of that stuff. Sometimes I'm like, this feels a little heady, and I'm not sure how much a lot of this can get solved. But this is a little bit, not entirely, but a little bit how I feel about TEEs too. It's like we basically spent years and many research man hours, and it's like, well, we kind of had TEs from the start. We could have saved ourselves a lot of time here if we just wanted to trust the boxes. And sometimes Solana is very focused on like make it go fast. And it's like, oh, that feels actually kind of tangible and real. Although, as we're going to get to in this episode, there are downsides to that being that focused on that sort of myopic view. Before we get there, I have a question for you. So the Polygon background is super helpful in terms of how you took a smart contract approach to dealing with MEV, which is extremely unique, I would say, because mostly when it comes to MEV, it's been basically what I would call sidecars or off-chain solutions. And it feels like even it's been interesting to watch. Like I've definitely gotten nerd sniped by the work that Georgios is doing over at Reth, and it feels like we're in it. We kind of seesaw in between trying to innovate at the either the consensus layer or the protocol layer versus the client layer. And it seems like we're moving back into a realm of client innovation now. But when you approach specifically MEV, what are the pros and cons in your view of these more off-chain sidecar approaches versus like smart contract protocol changes?
I think that fundamentally we start running into this very interesting scenario where with a lot of these sidecars and with a lot of these infrastructure approaches, you have this design that's really focused on simulations and on having predictable, reliable output to where someone will build a block, they will simulate the block, and they will know that this is exactly what will happen. I will have exactly this amount at the end of the block, and that this is my profit. And I think that's like a really useful paradigm for environments where that's feasible from an engineering standpoint. I think that if you look at PBS and you look at like who's going to have the most efficient block, and if you define efficient as extract the most value, which is questionable, but let's go with it. If you define that as like the most efficient block, then yeah, PBS is an ultra efficient system from a game theoretical standpoint, just in terms of value extraction. But where it gets interesting is that that all has a cost, and that cost is typically engineering, right? If you're sitting here doing a bunch of simulations, if you're building a block, which is like a O n to the something complexity problem, just like a type of problem that doesn't really scale well. It's also time consuming. Like it takes a lot of time to go through and simulate all of these transactions, and that's just for one block. If you were to try different permutations of the transactions in the block to try to optimize to figure out which block is the best, that also takes time. And this time that it takes to do these things means you have to stop making the block relatively like earlier than if you were working with a mechanism that didn't use something like PBS. And so when we're looking at these off-chain solutions, it's like, yeah, they're very efficient, much more efficient than, maybe not much more efficient, but they're more efficient than the smart contract solutions from a value capture standpoint, but much less so from an engineering efficiency standpoint, much less so from a latency standpoint, much less so from a throughput standpoint. PBS in general has this like 2 second long commit reveal mechanism where validators will commit to a block and then the block gets revealed. Like that alone is something that's not going to work on a blockchain that is, you know, only 2 seconds long. And so like the question becomes like, how do you start to deal with these systems on blockchains that are much, much faster?
Mm. How can you? Why does it need to be 2 seconds for the commit reveal? Is that in Ethereum land? Is that just the amount of time that it takes to get transmitted from the relayer to the proposer, revealed, block gets stamped, and then it needs the relayer has to shoot that all out for attestation, or what is that? What's the time requirement there?
I think it used to be a lot shorter. And then a very clever person was able to bamboozle the MevBoost relay and make off with $25 million because he was able to commit
Ah,
and then uncommit and then commit again. And so they increased the duration of the
is that low
deployment.
carb crusader?
Rest in
Mm,
peace.
wow, RIP. Yeah, turns out, by the way, going back to mechanism design versus illegality, turns out that's illegal. So you
Questionable,
can't do that.
questionable,
Yeah,
questionable.
yeah, yeah.
That
We'll
that
see.
is that is going to be a very interesting. Oh, dude, if you want a spicy subject, we can talk about that. That is going to be a very interesting court case
Mm,
because I think that what the low carb crusader did. Well, first of all, he definitely did some things that are not good. I think in general, when you're trying to hide or like obfuscate what you're doing, it's probably not a good thing that you're doing.
mm,
But what's interesting is that he didn't really do anything wrong. Like he did one thing to the relay and he did something else to Ethereum. And I think that like if you look at exploiting a system, in order for him to be perceived as having exploited it, you have to view the relay and Ethereum as the same thing. Because if you look at it from just the relay's perspective, Lookup Crusader behaved regularly. If you look at it from Ethereum's perspective, I mean, he equivocated. He got slashed, but that's like inside of the Ethereum system. The exploit was playing Ethereum and the relay against each other. And so one of the interesting things with that entire
mm.
court case is that there's sort of this commingling of this concept of the MevBoost relay and Ethereum. And like maybe the MevBoost relay should be considered a part of Ethereum. I'm not a lawyer, I don't know, but I do know that people are going to feel strongly about that one way or another, and it's going to be exciting to see how that plays out.
It's very funny that you bring that up. So people used to talk quite a bit about there was that great Barnaby article several years ago, seeing through the eyes of the protocol. And I think I just remember all these discussions about what should be within it's called the pomerium, right? Like of ancient, like the line of what is actually in protocol versus what is out of protocol. And then the meta level on top of that is, let's say that we design the protocol in such a way where we're reliant on large centralized actors to make it work. And that's how PBS is designed, right? What we're counting on via incentives is the creation of infrastructure like relays or large sophisticated financial actors in the form of builders to make what's actually inside of the protocol work. And then the question is, well, yeah, is that a part of the protocol? If we're explicitly depending on that, uh, is it part of the protocol? What dependencies do we have? Could we realistically rip that out? If we were to rip these dependencies out, what would break in the protocol? And there's, it's turtles all the way down. You could have the same conversation about L2s and centralized sequencers, and maybe they'll give up the keys, to the multi-sig at some point. Maybe it hasn't happened
Yeah.
today, so it's an interesting conversation about how these protocols are designed, I think.
It's going to be a major focus of that court case. And I
Yeah.
think what's really interesting is that there's clearly somebody with a lot of knowledge about Mev Boost and about Ethereum that has worked with the US Department of Justice and is painting a picture of Mev Boost and Ethereum being the same thing. And I think it'll be very, very high drama for everyone on crypto Twitter when we find out who those people are. I don't think they're
Yeah,
going to end up looking good.
yeah, this is gonna be an interesting. I guess I didn't bring my tinfoil hat with me, but yeah, that's. I've heard rumors about, about anyway, sources for that information, and it's going to be interesting. But it also, I remember people talking about this as well around the time that the ETFs were getting released. About there's going to be increased scrutiny on this space. Some of it very positive, some of it slightly less positive or more worrisome. And I think what people were worried about was the scrutiny that was going to get placed on the MEV transaction supply chain and now I think this was sort of the interesting first foray into that. Um, hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Fuel Labs, who's unveiling their new high performance Ethereum L2 Fuel Ignition. Many of you know Fuel as the launcher of the first optimistic stage 2 rollup on Ethereum with Fuel V1, and now they're launching Ignition to address some of the creeping centralization concerns around some L2 architectures today. And if you like nerding out about the tech, there's a lot of reasons to get excited about Ignition, including how they solve state sustainability and performance execution. They have this UTXO asset-centric architecture that's very, very cool. But there's a lot of other reasons to love it. Super easy to use. You can either use a Fuelet wallet or your existing Ethereum or Solana-based wallet like Phantom or MetaMask or whatever it is. There are cool apps that you can experiment with. And again, like I said at the top of the program, they're launching phase 2 of their points program. So click the link at the bottom of the show notes, head over, start having fun on Fuel Ignition today, and just tell them that I sent you. All right. All right, we took a little bit of a tangent there. I want to return. All right. So here we are. We've built this smart contracting solution on FastLane. And could you just give me the through line then in between what you were doing there with almost like, I would say, metering the transactions and ordering them, by a smart contract before they arrived at the validator? Into application specific sequencing, which I there's there's a small but mighty case to rebrand that to ACE instead of ASS, but I'm not sure we're going to be victorious on that particular front. But can you just give us the kind of some of the work that you're doing in application specific sequencing in general?
Yes. So with the like validator aligned MEV operations, we used a smart contract. And the reason why we had to use a smart contract is because we were in essence just throwing these transactions at a validator and we were throwing them in the right order, but we didn't know what the result of these transactions were going to be. Like
Mm,
we weren't able to simulate the transaction and be like, hey, this guy paid what he said he was going to pay, or like,
mm,
hey, this bot is going to be the best bot for the top of the block. We didn't know. We couldn't know because we weren't running a modified validator client. And so instead, what we did is we came up with this concept of flash execution, which is where we would have the searchers or the bots send their transactions to the Fastlane smart contract. Inside of this transaction, there would be call data. And the call data, like the first 4 bytes, are the function selector. And so when we are looking at these transactions as a relay, we can see, without simulating anything at all, we can see, hey, this is a transaction that is to the Fastlane smart contract, and it is calling this specific function on the Fastlane smart contract. No simulations were able to know that. We are also able to look at the call data and see exactly what their bid amount is. And so we would just throw these transactions at the validators in the order of their bid amounts without knowing which ones would succeed or which ones would fail. The failures did not get free reverts because we didn't know that any of the other ones in front of them would have succeeded. We couldn't know. And if we had given free reverts, then it would have been very easy for people to game the system. And so what our smart contract did and like where this concept of smart or of flash execution really came into play is that because these searchers were going through our entry point smart contract, we knew one of two things would happen. The smart contract enforced either that the searcher would effectively pay their bid by the end of the transaction, which meant they didn't have to pay us up front. They could actually start off with no money, execute the transaction, and then pay us at the very end. Or the transaction would revert and the MEV opportunity would be preserved for the second highest bidder or the third highest on down the list. And so this was a fascinating solution for us because we didn't have to simulate anything. We just have to sort. And by sorting and by throwing them at the validator in that order, we knew that the smart contract would take care of the rest. It was, in essence, an MEV settlement contract. Flash execution, very much modeled on how flash loans work, where if you don't pay
Yeah.
back the loan by the end, then the whole execution just reverts. And so we quickly realized that this approach that worked in the absence of just reliable simulation information. Like we spent a lot of time thinking about how searchers could break it. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how also to protect searchers from validators in case validators tried to mess with things to try to
Mm.
double collect payments themselves. And so when we started looking at this from a very adversarial standpoint, we are like, well, what if there's other transactions blocked ahead of time? We can't stop that. And we quickly realized that these are the same problems that applications face with application controlled execution. And so we started looking and thinking like, all right, well, what if we take this concept of flash execution, but we dial it down a little bit? Like, what if instead of taking transactions and throwing them at a validator, what if instead we take these EIP 712 signed messages and operations, if you will, and we cram them together inside of a single transaction, the same way that a block builder crams transactions inside of a block. And what's interesting about this is that, again, just like with flash execution for validators, we don't know what transactions are going to occur in front of an app's own transaction. And we don't know what transactions will occur after. And so we have to be very careful. We have to have smart contracts that'll enforce certain things and that are very good at making sure that no one is getting taken advantage of. A lot of checks. Um, uh, Definitely not as gas efficient as doing something that's simulation based and that can rely on accurate simulations. But this adversarial assumption and handling these adversarial assumptions with smart contract checks that are checking in real time, like during execution itself, allows apps to take these messages, aggregate them together, sort them however they want, either through like a smart contract logic or through infrastructure, through a sequencer of their own. Doesn't really matter how they do it. But in general, the settlement concept of sorting these operations into a single transaction, but also allowing for if something goes wrong, this is how we handle it. If these two things both want to do the same thing, this is how we address that. Like putting all of that into a smart contract, into a single transaction, is a great way for applications to internalize value. And it still fundamentally relies on this concept of flash execution, where if someone says they'll do something and they get sorted based on doing that thing, and then they don't do it, then one, we actually will charge them the gas for that portion of the transaction. But two, we just undo what they did.
Mm.
And it allows for the preservation of these opportunities. It allows for like internalization of MEV in a very robust way that works even in an environment that's as hostile as something like PBS.
Mm. Yeah, the reason I love this through line so much is because it's when people thought about MEV solutions in the past, they thought about going to the source of who was building the block. And the intuition even pre-merge in Ethereum is that there was mining, right? And there were these mining pool operators that had an enormous percentage of the hash power at the time. And so it was actually much easier to build and much more intuitive to go to the block builder level in terms of controlling MEV and making sure that it was the big problem they were trying to solve back then was the PGAs that were running. And because there is this funny constraint that you guys had working with Polygon and the foundation is that, hey, we actually have to approach this from the perspective of a smart contract, not this sidecar. And then it's like, well, what if we just move that up to the application itself, right? And instead of acting as an intermediary, act, we could craft a solution here where everyone kind of agrees that the apps and especially the users more so even than the apps should be getting this MEV back. It's not a great solution actually to just funnel a bunch of user I don't know user fees to validators. We probably want those to get kicked back to users from a UX perspective. So it's super interesting to get there. And now you have worked in a couple of different environments here, and I, 30 minutes in here, I want to get to the meat of what I wanted to chat with you about, which is that there are different execution environments where it's possible to do different things in the smart contracting layer. And so, could you walk us through a little bit, for folks that might actually be helpful? Could you just define what a virtual machine is? I'm sure everyone's heard that term a million times, but just give us a definition of a virtual machine. And then, what does the EVM look like today versus the SVM? How should we understand the major differences?
Gosh, I think one of the downsides of me coming from a TradFi background rather than engineering background is I don't actually know the succinct definition of a virtual machine. I've looked
It's
at
one of
the
those
code
questions
base
that you
for the
just panic
EVM.
about. Yeah.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
I can guess.
Mm.
I feel like a lot of people afterwards will be like, "That's incorrect." Like
Yeah.
to me though, a virtual machine, and again, my experience with that terminology is solely inside the bounds of like looking at the EVM, looking at the SVM, looking at Cosm Wasm. Um, for me, it's sort of a way to handle instructions
Mhm.
that a program is sending.
Mhm.
Whether that program is like a smart contract or on Solana, they actually call them programs. To me, it's like a way to parse and to handle a program. I
Yeah.
again, I don't know if that's right, but that's how I
That
look
no,
at it.
hey, I'm not gonna be the one to fact check you on it, but, yeah, I think that's how I conceptualize of it as well. It's a set of rules in terms of how those instructions can get transmitted, et cetera, and there are big differences in terms of what that virtual machine actually looks like. So, walk us through, I guess, the EVM and some of its core components and the SVM and how, you know, especially more non-technical people should understand what the difference is in between them.
I think one of the major differences has to do with like, composability and engineering, and just in general, what things you should allow and whether this new property or this new action that you're allowing uh, hinders throughput disproportionately. And I think Ethereum and Solana are both very opinionated on how they view that question. Ethereum allows for a lot of smart contracts to call a lot of other smart contracts. I think like the max call depth is I want to say 64. You can have up to like a thousand, slightly over 1,000 different like words, which are like 32 bytes. You get like a very you can do a lot with it. But the thing that I'm most interested in is the fact that Ethereum actually allows for these partial reverts. And so before we had been talking about flash execution for apps and application specific sequencing. For us, the reason why these partial reverts are so important is because inside of a single transaction, we can do something and then check, did it finish doing what it said it was going to finish doing before we started doing it? And if the answer is no, then we can revert back to where we were before we started that. And then the transaction can just go on and do the next one. And this is great. This is something that allows for just a very high level of composability. For searchers, this really adds to this concept of on chain solving, which is where you are able to do like route finding or searching on chain in order to like capture arbitrage without maybe a full view of all of the information necessary. And again, this is something that's very useful in high throughput environments where simulations are unreliable. So you kind of have to outsource some of the execution into your smart contract
Mm.
through things like on-chain solving or like on-chain. So like one of the things I used to do back in the day was on-chain swap amount calculation, where I would just swap different amounts, figure out which was the most profitable, and then went with that. And so EVM allows this. You can go very, very deep into the stack. You can do like a lot of calls within calls within calls within calls, and you can partially revert all of them. Solana is very opinionated on throughput. The downside to the EVM's ability to do partial reverts is that when you look at this from a memory management standpoint, each time you do a call that you have this like option to undo the call, like each time you go down that path, if you start executing something, but you want to be able to go back to where you were before, you have to copy the state to return to. Like if you start making changes to the state that you want to be able to undo, you have to still store the previous state to revert back to somewhere. And so with Ethereum and its ability to just go like very, very deep into the call stack, you can get like a not small amount of memory just used up storing state that you need to be able to go back to. And so Solana looks at this and it looks at like the memory overhead of doing this kind of thing. And it's like, that hurts throughput. That's not what we're about. You know, we are the fastest chain, we are the highest throughput chain, so we're not going to allow partial reverts. And like they're not wrong if you view high throughput as being the most important thing to focus on, because it does. Like they're right. Like if you're copying everything to memory every time you make a call, then you're going to have a pretty big burden on memory. Also, Solana, I believe they only allow a call stack depth of 5 programs. Like you can't even really go that deep into like layers of allowing transactions to like call, or programs in Solana, or smart contracts in Ethereum, programs in Solana. Like you can't really have too many programs call other programs. There's like a maximum depth. But more importantly, with Solana and with the SVM, if a single person wants to revert or undo something, if a single actor that's like sharing a transaction wants to revert or undo, then it just cancels the entire transaction and everything
Mm.
fails. Which means like if something goes wrong, you can't have error handling. You can't have my favorite term is actually error accounting, which is where if something goes wrong, maybe you have to, handle balances or handle for accounting adjustments or gas attribution to assign the gas cost to the entity that screwed everything up for everybody else. There's a lot of stuff that you can't do in the SVM because every party inside of a transaction, every program, every actor has the ability to just cancel the whole thing and undo everything for everyone else. It's like if you're playing a game of kickball and a kid loses, then he just takes out a knife and slashes the ball, and then no one can play kickball anymore. Is kind of
Mm.
how the SVM works with like sharing a transaction. And from our point of view, this
It's
really,
quite official.
um, this happened to me like one time. I'll never forget it.
Yeah,
Bill,
didn't
how
stick
dare
with you
you?
though. Yeah, it didn't
Yeah,
stick with you.
it was 30 years ago, but it's stuck in my mind. But no. So like the way that it works on Solana is that like you can't have adversarial actors share a transaction. And this means you can't sequence adversarial actors inside of a transaction. And it's like, well, adversarial actors, if you're trying to attack each other, sure. But like, what if it's just party counterparty and you're trying to do something where the counterparty wants to get a free look? And so they bid high, and then all of a sudden it uh, price moves against them. And so they want to undo it. And so they pay for a front run to, inventory. There's like a lot of things where in Ethereum, we can handle these problems by just stacking a bunch of different solutions behind the user so that if a handful of these solvers end up not doing what they said they were going to do, that's fine because we've got a whole bunch of other solvers atomically like available. And this is a good UX too, where you can have all these solutions. You can have a user submit something, and it's one transaction that the front end can track. And so the user has robust confidence in execution quality because if one solver messes up, they know that they've got 10 other solvers that'll execute afterwards, like sorted
Mm.
and ready to go.
Mm.
And you can't do that on Solana because if the first solver messes up, then all of the other solvers won't execute because it's a revert. And so you run into these like free look problems where one solver can just bid high and then cancel it for everyone else if they don't get what they want. You run into on-chain solving problems where you lose the ability to have two parties do on-chain solving concurrently,
Mm,
where like one person says, all right, I'm going to do some computations with real-time atomic state. Okay, after I've done these computations, this is how much I want. And then another solver says, all right, let me do some computations and this is what I can give you. Like you can't really do that very effectively on Solana because if either one of those parties wants to back out, they cancel it for the other party rather than allowing for someone else to take their place. And to me, and this is probably the spiciest part of the whole thing, I think that's quite slow. I think that's like very slow. And the reason why I think that's slow is because on Solana, like you have to add in these off-chain network hops where it's like, all right, let's get it on chain. All right, it's on chain. Now we're going to read what's on chain in this off-chain network, off-chain infrastructure. And then now we're going to send in this new thing and will it land? Will it not? We don't know. Let's figure it out. But you're adding in these infrastructure dependencies to handle solving because you can't do solving on chain in a robust permissionless way because no partial reverts. And the alternative is to do it off chain.
mm,
And I will, go on the record saying that it is always faster to do stuff on chain than off chain, even if your chain's throughput is 10%. The fact that you can have these parties execute atomically, that's instantaneous. And I think Solana has, unfortunately, just in pursuit of having a really, really high TPS, I think Solana has built in these infrastructure dependencies where there's just a lot of off chain simulations that have to happen and a lot of state that has to propagate to off chain sources in order for parties to interact.
mm. So I want to get to a conclusion here because I found myself thinking something as you're talking. But before, can you just you've been can you just land the plane for in that Guart episode that you did recently? And I saw you going back and forth a little bit with Kyle Money on Twitter. This dynamic of no partial reverts on in the SVM, in your mind, makes it difficult to potentially impossible to do something like ACE, application controlled execution. So walk us through that. Just help us land the plane on that line of reasoning.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, with a lot of these application specific sequencing, the entire purpose of application specific sequencing is to sequence things in a way that the validator might not want it to be sequenced. The idea is to remove this dependency on the validator because if you don't remove the dependency on the validator, then you have this actor who could potentially insert themselves into the roles and who could potentially make a lot of money by really leaning into their own monopoly on block production. And so, like with application specific sequencing, the idea is to handle the sequencing without needing any sort of dependency whatsoever on the validator. And on Solana, there's really two ways to do it. The first is by, or really not even on Solana, just in every ecosystem. There are two ways to do it. The first is by taking operations or actions and sequencing them inside of a single transaction. And on Solana, this doesn't work because on Solana, if a single one of those actors wants to revert or undo, then it cancels it for everybody. And this has a very bad UX. It's a very bad UX because if you're a user of an app and just one of the other people in your batch, let's say, wants to revert or undo, then all of a sudden your transaction gets undone too. And it's a deal breaker for apps. The second way that any entity in Ethereum land can express a constraint around sequencing that the validators have to follow is through this concept of nonces. And people in Ethereum are very familiar with nonces. If you have a transaction from an account and that account's nonce is 9, then that transaction with a nonce 9 has to come before another transaction from the same account with a nonce of 10. You can't, validators can't first mine 10 and then mine 9. It has to be in that sequential ascending order. And so, an alternative way to do application specific sequencing, which is different from how Fastlane does it, would just be to have a transaction, like an account that actually is just signing these transactions from the application in a certain order. And validators wouldn't be able to change the sequence. They would have to mine those transactions in that order. They could censor, but they couldn't actually alter the sequence. And on Solana, there are no nonces. There is this concept of a block hash. The last 150, I believe, 150 block hashes are available for users. And it can, like users, in order to show that a transaction is relatively recent, they will include one of these block hashes inside of their transaction. And that is proof that this is like a recent transaction. That block hash has to be part of the blockchain, or the hash, or the chain of block hashes. And so it's a way for users to, have confidence that this transaction will get mined soon. And if it's not mined soon, if it's not mined dependent on the like actual state of the block, then it won't get mined. And so in that sense, it's a good system. But there's no way to use that to express any sort of constraint over like the ordering of these transactions inside of a block. And so those are the two ways in operations inside of a block, or operations inside of a transaction, and transactions inside of a block can't do robust sequencing with either one of them on Solana.
So if there are any SVM engineers out there who are listening, thinking, "Aha! But I have a way," hit me and Alex up because I want to hear the
Please.
counter to this. The All right. So here's what I found myself thinking as we are giving this description. It is, I wonder if we're about to watch the beginning of Solana alignment to some degree. Because what alignment really is inevitably when you are engineering large complex systems, you have to make trade-offs. And the trade-off should align with kind of the vision of what you're building, which, and there's an ideology and a value set. And what alignment is basically extolling the virtue of our values and not being so kind to people who go outside of the bounds of those values. And so
Yes.
in Ethereum land, what that has looked like is, hey, we've made these trade-offs where we think that ETH is money. And when you kind of do these things that make ETH behave not as money or imply that it's not money or something like that, we do not actually appreciate that very much. And so we would keep that out of our little domain. Thank you very much. And for Solana, what it seems like it is like it's speed, it's increase bandwidth, reduce latency, right? That is the guiding principle. And we had a great panel at Permissionless this year with some of the Cosmos guys, and they described the gravity, this inevitable force of people wanting to build their own chains. And I think this is going to be Solana's challenge here is they're trying to keep everyone on one shared layer, and the inevitable gravitational pull is for people to build their own chains off of it. Now, the way that even just doing the episode last week with Anatoly is, keeping the block times very short, but there are other UX things like in it, what you would like, right? If you're trying to, you know, not discourage, but L2s don't really fit the one shared layer set of values and trade off is, well, it'd be nice if you then have to find another way to give applications the ability to exert the sovereignty and control over their own economics that they would want, which is ACE. But now it doesn't seem like
Yes.
ACE is potentially possible. So it'll be, I guess, something to figure out. You know, maybe it could be overcome with engineering, but that's where my mind went a little bit as you were giving that description.
So I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there. And from my point of view, I look at Solana, I look at a ecosystem that is just laser focused on high throughput, but that has made sacrifices, that has, hit certain trade-offs, made certain trade-offs in order to focus on throughput the way that they have. Meanwhile, in the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got Ethereum, which has just completely given up on throughput, but is very focused on mechanism design, on composability. They don't have single slot finality yet, but they know that they need it.
Mm.
And so they're moving towards certain things, and they're very values driven. I personally think both of them are wrong. I think that both of them are maxis, and I think that neither one of them are remotely close to an efficient point in the trade-off spectrum. I
Mm.
think that if you have 100,000 TPS, but like 95,000 of that is just spam because your mechanisms are so lacking in robustness that they incentivize spam, then it's like, do you really have a high TPS, or are you just like, designing mechanisms that, or designing engineering that just makes mechanisms that stop spam, harder to do? And I would argue that application controlled execution is something that helps mitigate spam. And so from our perspective, I'm very, very, very excited about Monad. And the reason why
I
I'm
was
so
gonna say,
excited about Monad, yeah.
is the chain on the frontier of that design what's on your hat by any chance? Or yeah.
In my mind, yes. And the reason why is
By
because
the way, Monad, I've made it clear that I can be bribed with swag on this podcast. So I've received
dude,
no
their swag
Monad
is so good.
hats. I know I've seen the little ball and dock stuff. It's like, hey, I would I'm a small and proud Monad bag holder actually. So yeah, hey, any swag, you can send it my way here. And yeah,
Dude, my favorite Monad swag are my socks, dude. I've got these amazing Monad socks. They're so comfy. I
nice.
absolutely love them.
Maybe it's just getting a little older. I just really deeply appreciate a good pair of socks. There are these Bomba socks that are like $25. It's ridiculous. It's stupid for a price, but they're so soft. They're so thick. It's like my feet are walking around on clouds all day. Just
Yeah,
you appreciate a good pair of socks. But
love it.
all right,
Yeah.
talk to us
So
about Monad a little bit and just why it is what is this efficient frontier that you see in between Ethereum, which has basically given up on execution. Maybe Solana is a little bit too optimized for throughput. Why does Monad fit at the efficient frontier space there?
so I love Monad because Monad has the EVM, and the EVM allows for application controlled executions, or as some people call it, application specific sequencing, because it allows for applications to take, like we were talking about before, to take these operations or these actions from adversarial users, batch them all together, throw in smart contract logic around it, and make it composable and make it compose with each other and make it atomic in a way where like one or two bad actors inside of the batch can't ruin the party for everybody else. And so like on Monad, you can do that, and you can do that very easily. And more importantly, like for application specific sequencing or application controlled execution, it's very easy for apps to, like, while they're in the process of doing that, like they can add an extra gas fee that accrues to the app's DAO, or that goes to just like the app's sequencer, or however it sequences these operations. And so you can get these effectively all of the same benefits of an app chain. If someone can think of a benefit that you can't get with this, please debate me. I am very open to debating on this subject. Just keep in mind, I've actually built out a lot of these like alternative designs as well, just to see. But like at the end of the day, you can get all of these same benefits of an app chain without having to abandon the ecosystem that the app developed in. And so for us, and I mean, like Mike, you see this all the time. Alignment is very, very important. And one of the like very interesting things that we have seen is that like apps love our system because apps can stay in the ecosystem that they have such strong alignment with. They don't have to make their own app chain. They don't have to disrupt composability with any of their ecosystem partners. But like most of all, it's like they're not betraying the team that they were probably working pretty close with right up until that point. And like, yeah, just very, very interested in that.
I have a complicated feeling about the word alignment as it's used in crypto. It's one of those things where I've got two different ideas in my head that I oscillate in between, which is on the one hand, you need alignment because it's very important to get people rowing in the same direction. I am sympathetic to the current critique of Ethereum that there isn't a North Star. And some people say that doesn't matter. Everyone needs to be in the same direction. You need to get people bought into one idea and mission so that you're not shooting off in 1,000 different directions. And organizations will actively work against each other in that case. And so you need to do that. On the other hand, I dislike alignment in the sense of I feel like in practice, it ends up looking a lot like social shaming to achieve outcomes, which I don't like. So maybe there's just a better way of doing this than I've seen. But yeah, I have complicated feelings about the word alignment in general.
I think that alignment is a fascinating subject. I agree with you completely, especially about the social shaming. I am notoriously shameless, which is maybe why I've not been affected by this and why I continue to be viewed as somewhat unaligned. But for me, like what's really interesting is that we're kind of seeing in real time in Ethereum land, especially, how a lot of what started off as like kind of like an ethos, how a lot of this alignment has started to become more about business and about commercialization.
Mm,
Just this last week, we've seen a lot of people very loudly talking about Ethereum is, strong and robust, and L2s are Ethereum. And I look and I'm like, all right, well, who's saying this? And I click on it, and it's, oh wow, this person works for an L2. That's so weird.
mm,
And it just like this strong sense of Ethereum alignment, where typically the thing that is being put up as being aligned with Ethereum is being put up by people that benefit from that perception, such as L2s benefit from being perceived as being Ethereum aligned.
mm,
And so when you look at like people that don't have L2s or that aren't really in any way connected to L2s or have any sort of business dependencies or revenue dependencies or future plans to be on an L2, when those people say that L2s are Ethereum, I listen. That means a lot to me. And I don't know that L2s aren't. I personally think it's a gray area, as with everything in crypto. But like, what's fascinating to me is just that all of the people that I saw saying that like L2s are Ethereum over the last like 2 weeks have some sort of critical business dependency on an L2.
mm.
And to me, that just makes the whole thing seem very disingenuous. I don't doubt that at the very least there's some sort of like coordination effort. At least someone has to know something. Like when I see like the Arbitrism or Arbitrum CEO and like the Optimism people, like they're saying like L2s are Ethereum. It's like, well, of course you want people to think that you are L2.
Mm.
And that trickles down. A lot of these narratives are propagated, a lot of these narratives are driven, and I think that we're going to continue to see more and more like co-opting of the social layer for this alignment, because for all of the alignment pushes we've seen so far, there are clear uh, beneficiaries for those pushes. um,
Yeah. Yeah. So here's a challenge that, all right. So to make one final statement on alignment. Here's the reason I really don't like it more so than I recognize it as being in some instances necessary, because it allows, this was Sam Bankman-Fried, for all he did wrong, said something that stuck with me at least, and I think a lot of other people, is it's that quote about we in the Western world, you just say the right shibboleths and you're in. And
yeah.
that is the real issue from a functional standpoint with alignment, is if you just say the words that you know that everyone wants you to say, it allows you to avoid a level of scrutiny, which I think is actively harmful in a lot of situations. And but with Ethereum, so people don't really frame it like this, but I think it's a very interesting question, especially for new L1s like Monad to think about, which is, all right, what are IV rollups is inevitable. I know everyone's like, hey, is the Rolex centric roadmap a mistake? That's, who cares? Because it's out, the genie's out of the bottle and it's not going back in. So we're getting rollups. Now the question is, what services should the L1 provide to the rollups? And then what is the service model? And what I mean by the service model is how much do you leave up to the L1 versus how much do you allow the private sector, to the market, to provide solutions? And I think that one of the things that one of the things that Ethereum didn't get right is it had too minimal of an offering to its L2s to the point where it's not sticky. I don't really see, I don't see the L2s going off and being their own L1s, but in the current construction where it's a multi-sig, and most of these L2s are trending towards being Validiums, right? They're not using ETH for DA, they're only using it for settlement. The pain of becoming your own L1 is not very large. Whereas if you look at a based roll-up construction, which I'm slowly getting pilled is the best construction from the perspective of Ethereum, TBD, the challenge is, are they going to be able to make it to market before some of these frameworks get critical mass? That's the challenge. But I think that would, it looks much more painful to rip out a base rollup. It looks much more, actually, Ethereum's providing many more critical services to the rollup than in the current construction. And then, one of the things about Ethereum that I just can't tell. I guess we just have to wait to the fullness of time, is what is the right, they have left a lot of things up to the free market to build. And the trade-off of doing that is, the free market's usually better at providing solutions than the quote unquote public sector, which is in this case the L1. And that's kind of what happened, right? With sharding is we tried to build sharding within the F, weren't really successful. Said, hey, market, figure it out. And it did figure it out, but in a way that had these weird incentives and potential drawbacks. So that is the way that I think about this question.
I'd push back a little bit on one of the things you had mentioned, which is about how the free market is better at coming up with solutions.
Mm,
I don't think. I mean, like in a broader economy, yes, absolutely. I'm in no way am I saying that we should go down some sort of government control market. In
right.
general, I think that's true. But I think that when it comes to L1s in general, I am not
Mm,
convinced that L2s are better at coming up with solutions. I am convinced that they're faster at coming up with solutions.
mm,
And one of the problems that I am just like terrified of with crypto in general, and we've already seen this play out, it's way easier to make some centralized solution and to just be like, oh, we'll decentralize it later. And like, there you go. Now you've got literally every L2. And so, like, in a sense, it's fast and like, hey, we've got this solution and it's fast, but it's a shit solution. And the problem with all this like centralization and the fact that like the free market, yeah, it's better solutions, but it's also faster solutions. And I think the faster solutions are what we're seeing the most of. And the reason why that worries me so much in DeFi is that it is always just orders of magnitude faster to have a central, like to make a centralized solution than to make a decentralized one. And the reason why like I push back on this like L2s being having better solutions is because in large part the L1 is going to only want to make decentralized solutions.
mm.
And there's an argument to be made that like hey, maybe users aren't sensitive to centralized solutions, and I would say they can go use a regular bank if that's how they feel. But like at the end of the day, to me, I do think that there's danger in letting whoever is first to market set the narrative for that market, especially when being centralized helps a lot with being first to market. And especially when, if there is one thing that history has taught us about all of this, it's that people with centralized power are very hesitant to release it. And so all of these promises were like, oh, it's just centralized for now, but we've got a solution in mind. We'll decentralize later. It's like, okay, because that worked so well for the last 100 apps that said that exact same thing. Like
I know.
it's it's history, man. Like
All right, here is a okay. So basically, and then I want to get to the spice here about, because there's a very interesting standards conversation to be had, especially within the context of Ethereum or just generally modular blockchains. But the I'd be curious. Here's how I see the current L2 landscape today. I think there are three potential solutions here. One is the current state, which is mainly multi-sigs, optimistic rollups that settle down to ETH, and they've got the critical mass at the current moment, and they're going to be very influential in terms of setting standards up at that layer. Then there is another solution, which is, and the challenge, by the way, there is interop, because there's just no incentive to be interop. There is plenty of incentive for OP stack chains to be interoperable with one another, Arbitrum Orbit chains to be interoperable. There is no incentive for an Arbitrum Orbit chain and an OP stack chain to be interoperable with one another.
it's politics. Yep.
Right. Then there is, it's a social problem. Then there's another solution where there is some sort of ZK proof ag layer combined with a shared sequencer, where there's, but we'd have to we have to make ZK tech actually economically feasible, which every year it's happening next year. But I believe we're on the cusp here. I talked to Uma, but some sort of proof aggregation layer with a shared sequencer, where then you probably get, maybe latency is still an issue, but you get pretty good interop in between different rollups. And then there is the base rollup approach, where you're using Ethereum as the shared sequencer here. And I I don't know. My I could see a couple of different ways of this playing out. I think base rollups, I'm in the camp now that it would be the best solution for the market if we could get there. The challenge is going to be, can the base rollup scale faster than the existing solutions can start to look like monopolies? Then there's another solution of that both the shared sequencing layer and the ag layer. It's another social problem, right? You got to convince these large frameworks to buy into this idea. And then the other one is just that you have a couple dominant frameworks that win out, and also hopefully like swap in ZK tech as opposed to being optimistic like they are today. And I could see it playing out a couple of different ways. I'm not really sure. What is your what do you think the roll up landscape looks like in 5 years?
That's a good question. I think there's what I think it will look like, and then there's what I hope it'll look like, and I think that
Yeah.
those two things aren't really the same thing.
Mm,
Um, from my perspective, just kind of like double back on a few of the things that you had said. Um, a lot of these scenarios, like a lot of these systems, do not have this critically important concept of single slot finality. Um, uh, Take, for instance, Ethereum, no single slot finality. It's on the roadmap. I hope my grandkids will be able to enjoy it. I'm not expecting it anytime soon. Um, uh, from my perspective, an L2 that's on Ethereum sort of inherits the lack of single slot finality. And yeah, you can, do all these complex things where it's like, oh, we'll use eigenlayer and we'll rebond and we'll like, reimburse if there's any, then we'll do slashing and it'll be, and it's like I get it, and like yeah, you can kind of do it in these like really backwards ways, but it's still you still don't get like the same kind of robust composability that a network like Cosmos has natively. Like every chain in Cosmos is single slot finality, and so they can do intra chain or interchain transfers through their IBC system in a really like robust, clean way. And like that's interop right there, and it's really easy and it's really clean, and it's because of single slot finality. I think Ethereum is still a pretty long way away from single slot finality, and I think that the L2s, because they inherit the finality from Ethereum, uh, they're not going to be competitive from a technological standpoint as long as they're on Ethereum. Another system that you had brought up, and I think this is something that's critically important to understand, like in the ZK space. And if a ZK engineer disagrees with what I'm saying, or if I'm saying it wrong, please let me know and push back. But like the way that these aggregated proof systems work is by deferring finality in an interop setting, is by deferring finality until all of the proofs are proven. And so that it's if you've got an interop system where you've got four chains transferring between them, none of them have finality until you've got all four proofs, and then you
right.
aggregate them together, and then the layer that they're settling to verifies that none of them are doing anything that exceeds the like inventory that had gone in. You've got this sort of like robust atomic inventory accounting system, but this happens like it's really like kicking in like as the proofs are being finalized and verified, and you need all of them before you can give any of them finality, and that
Mm,
is a very delayed finality. If like every chain is only as fast as the slowest chain that it's interoperable with, especially in the ZK space, like some of them might have fast proofs, but some of them might be trying to prove some like really complex stuff. And so to me, again, like these networks might be interoperable with each other, but they're not really going to be able to have easy interoperability with networks that are not a part of their system. And so for me, I genuinely think that single slot finality is critically important because it like single slot finality, like all of these solutions are solutions that are elaborate and involved and that have many steps that typically have like massive costs of capital just because you have to have economic security, and that's going to cost something because someone's going to have to put that money there. And it's very elaborate solutions to a problem that doesn't need to exist to begin with.
mm,
And so for me, like maybe I'm left curving this, but I think that just a chain with single slot finality that has an environment that allows application specific sequencing, like it's not clear to me why it's not clear to me what benefits you could get in one of these like more complicated, slower systems that you wouldn't be able to have just by being an app on a chain with shared state with other apps, and that has single slot finality, so that you can be composable even with apps that are on other chains with single slot finality.
Do you have a sense of where single slot finality is in terms of prioritization right now for on Ethereum?
The problem with single slot finality on Ethereum is solo stakers.
Oh, really?
Um, yeah, the
Hmm.
the issue is that, like, the way the epochs work is you get some of the validators. So an epoch is, I want to say, 32 blocks. You get some of the validators in, and they're voting on each other. But then during the next epoch, all of the stakers are getting their votes in on the previous epoch. So it's kind of like
Hmm.
it's like a scaling solution where first this small set does it, and then the next epoch, I think, like, each block, one out of every 32 solo stakers, let's call them, is actually voting on the entirety of the previous epoch, like all of those blocks at once. So it's like 1/32 votes on all of the previous 32 blocks. And it's like one of these things where if you start trying to have everyone vote on everything so that you can have single slot finality, it's a lot of network messaging. It's a lot of
Hmm.
delays. That solo staker on the moon's not going to be able to get his vote in on time to be
Right.
counted. And so it's problematic. There are solutions, like rainbow staking is one that I've heard of, that's very optimistic. I don't know as much about it as I'd like to.
Mm.
This is a problem where, from my point of view, it's the most important thing for Ethereum to work on. If this is this is me being unaligned with unaligned people, if Ethereum could choose between having a 3-second block time or having single slot finality, I would rather it go with single slot finality, just so it can like, so much of this just fluff and just this, like, baggage that's, like, being built up around the chain for composability would just no longer be needed if we have single slot finality.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. The solo staker thing is challenging. This is also part of ETH alignment here. Is the got to protect the Raspberry Pi solo stakers, and I know Max Resnick is waging a war against the solo stakers at the moment. I don't know. I think one of the best parts about Ethereum, the parts that I really love about it, is how optimistic it is and how the average person is so hopeful about the future. The challenge with that can be unwillingness to make compromises at times. And there is this history of the market walking back the solutions that Ethereum has tried to mitigate. And I actually, it's probably 2 years ago now, but I went on Bankless actually and did an episode on this. And the two things that I think they shouldn't have optimized for as hard as they did is non no in protocol delegation, because what you just wound up with was, like, I'm a huge fan of Lido, but what they did was surrender. Clearly there's consternation about it, and people are worried that they've handed over the keys to a very critical part of ETH's infrastructure. And you know uh, I understand both sides of the argument. I feel like I like Lido a lot, and then there's the home stakers, and the trade-off on the side of the home stakers is, you know, the less that you can do on chain, the more you push stuff off chain. And this is why I don't really like these myopic definitions of what decentralization means. Like, I see a push to define what decentralization means, and I really like that, because is a system more generally what people are talking about when they talk about decentralization is hardware and bandwidth requirements for L1 validators. But really, what the product these blockchains offer are strong settlement assurances. You want to know that your inbound transaction isn't going to get reversed for XYZ reasons. And the original thought about that is, if you make the validators too big, they're going to likely end up being companies that can be subject to government seizure or enforcement action or whatever, and you're not going to have those nice properties. The other way that you could not have those nice properties is if the system scales to a certain degree that you can no longer accommodate on chain, and you're outsourcing critical tasks to that small group of of actors that you were trying to avoid in the first place, that is another way that the chain is less decentralized. It is, because again, it's not
Absolutely.
decentralization is not an end, it is a means. And The means at the end is that you have these strong settlement assurances that your transactions don't get reversed. So sorry, I just went on a bit of a rant there, but I think I would love to see more nuance around that word. You know.
Totally. And like from my point of view too, we see this in a very direct way as we're doing, our work with applications. When we're talking to apps that are on Ethereum, like the way our design works is that we can do a lot of stuff on chain. And unfortunately, doing stuff on chain costs gas.
Mhm.
And because of that, on Ethereum, a lot of the apps that we talk to are like, you know what, rather than verifying this on chain, let's just have the relay do it. And that's more centralized. That is taking something like on chain verification, on chain like route finding, on chain like sorting. It uses more gas, it's expensive. And so, just by virtue of like Ethereum having relatively limited block space, like they are very directly incentivizing the applications built on top of Ethereum to centralize so
Mhm.
that they don't have to pay these costs, right? And so, like to me, there's definitely the first order like centralization, which is where we're not going to do it. We're going to expect someone else to do it. And then, typically the first person to come in is the first person to actually ship something. And that's typically, the person who's comfortable with centralizing it. But also, you've got all these second order, like economic incentivizations of centralization, where if you make
Mhm.
block space really expensive, people are going to try not to use as much of it. And that
Right.
means having other centralized dependencies. And if all the apps on a chain are centralized, then is the chain itself like really able to say that it's like the most decentralized chain? And it's like, yeah, I guess maybe, but like, I don't know. It's
You
it's
know,
very vague.
I have these problems with this too. I feel like I've thought too hard about RWAs recently, where I'm like scratching my head and questioning that what sort of benefits that you're getting. Like when you look at something like RWAs, especially issued on an L2, which has other critical dependencies, right? You're like, all right, the benefit of blockchains are because they're slow and more expensive, is that you get these nice censorship resistant settlement assurance properties. And it's like, do you get that at all for RWAs on? And I'm not, I should say, like, I'm very positive on the L2s for the most part. Like, I know we're giving you guys a bit of a hard time on this episode, but like, I understand. Like, the other thing too that I will say in defense is that when you meet these teams, I don't think they're bullshitting or intentionally gaslighting. It's like I really believe that they believe what they're saying, but there are additional dependencies in the way that they're constructed now. And so, okay, I'm the holder of an RWA, and who can rug me? A lot of people can rug me. I can get rugged by the L2. I can get rugged by the issuer. It's like, who cares at that point if the L1 is even decentralized? Like, I could already get rugged by these other two sources. And the other thing is, I'm less convinced that I used to be that RWAs are even bullish for the L1 asset, because if the whole bet that we're trying to make right now is that these L1s are money, then RWAs like treasuries and stablecoins compete with that money use case. So I'm unclear on who's winning. Does that make sense?
Makes a
I
lot
don't
of
know.
sense.
I feel like I've thought too hard about it, and I'm winding myself up. But yeah, that's I'm on a little bit of that thought train at the current moment.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think that fundamentally, a lot of people look at crypto as this solution for everything
Yeah.
and expect it to be perfect. I think that crypto maybe can't be everything. I think that sometimes in order to do things, it has to make trade offs. And like the RWA thing, for instance, like I think you're 100% right. I think that at the end of the day, crypto is like decentralized, but also, if there's some sort of like linking to these, off chain assets, then yeah, you're going to be vulnerable through that link. And so to me, it's like, yeah, like I don't think crypto can be everything. But if you look in TradFi, you look at futures contracts or forwards, you've got the same like thing going on, right? You've got like even with like some of these like notes, you've got this. The security is subject to the credit risk of the underwriter, or like to the credit risk of the issuer, and that's a problem. And I like that's still a problem in crypto. And so I don't know that that's a problem that crypto should solve. I don't know that it's a problem crypto can solve. And so, from my point of view, I think what is interesting is that, one of the perks is, let's say an L2 does rug somebody,
Mhm.
USDC can unrug that person if they
Yeah,
wanted to.
that's totally true. And look, I can hear people's responses to this already. This is not an attack. I'm just pontificating out loud on a podcast, which is always dangerous to do. I understand all the good reasons why we've imported RWAs. There's the yield that for protocols like Maker, multi-collateral DAI has been super helpful to expand the DAI supply. I get it. I understand all of those reasons. And I'm not a purist in the sense that I don't know. I think one of the valid criticisms of Bitcoin over the years is that it is a little bit too purist. And look, sometimes it's okay to make a series of compromises. I'm completely okay with that. Alex, unfortunately, we're out of time here. We didn't get to we might have to do a part two of this because we had a whole other segment planned, and that's my fault as the interviewer here. I got detoured, but I got into what we were chatting about. So so we're gonna have to
I
do
had
a
fun.
we might have to do a part two to this podcast. But yeah, man, this has been great. Also for listeners who, we just kind of said, hey, who might have counterpoints to any of the stuff on the engineering limitations on Solana, or we'll have to offer a rebuttal to some of the Solana or Ethereum people who object to Monad as this central point of efficiency or whatever. Open to
So far.
rebuttals here on any and all of the above, right? But Alex, man, it's always a pleasure to talk. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And if people want to find out more about what you're building, what's the best way for them to follow you or get more information or whatever?
Yeah, definitely give me a follow on Twitter. Fastlane, the website fastlane.xyz. We are right now just very focused on Monad, and the question of taking a lot of these concepts we've talked about today and fusing them together in a way that allows apps and validators to work synergistically and to add value to each other, underpinned through a liquid staking token. But most of all, is the best way to find out about Fastlane is to follow our core ethos, which is to just look on chain. And for
Mm,
us, a lot of these problems, by just handling things on chain, we can solve them. And so if you really want to learn about Fastlane, find us on chain.
hell yeah, brother. Love that. All right, dude. Love to do it again soon. Thanks so much for coming on. Guys, check out
Thanks for
Fastlane.
having me.